With that, we'll move to the formal part of the program. So welcome to today's edition of The World Today, in which we'll look through the lens of the Cold War at the linkages between science and academia and national defense. We'll learn more about the roles of academics, including Penn anthropologists, played in advancing science and peace in the 1950s, while at the same time building intelligence networks and underwriting the proliferation of nuclear technology globally. In exploring this history, we hope to reflect on the conflicts and nuclear tensions of today and the push and pull of peace and violence in shaping the global order. But first, let's welcome our distinguished guests to the stage, M. Susan Lindy, Lynn Meskel, and Tom Shattuck. And by way of brief introduction, because you've got their full introductions online, M. Susan Lindy is the Janice and Julian Bears Professor of the History and Sociology of Science at Penn and a scholar of Cold War science and technology. She holds a PhD from Cornell University and has taught at Penn since 1990. Her scholarly interests include the history of radiation risk and the impact of militarization on the professional experiences of scientists in the Cold War. She was previously Associate Dean in the School of Arts and Sciences, is currently chair of her department, and is a Guggenheim Fellow. Lynn Meskel is a Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor, Richard D. Green Professor of Anthropology in the School of Arts and Sciences, Professor in the Graduate Program in Historic Preservation at the Weitzman School of Design, and Curator in the Middle East and Asia sections at the Penn Museum. She is also the A.D. White Professor at Large at Cornell University. Meskel is a fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. And last but not least, she is a fellow here at Perry World House. Please join me in welcoming our guests to the stage. Terrible mistakes. I didn't turn my paper over. I'm so sorry. I cannot leave this unaddressed. Our moderator. So this is one of the greatest parts of the entire evening. So you have the great fortune of having today's program moderated by a Perry World House staff member, Thomas Shattuck, who's our program manager for Global Order. He's a former deputy director of the Asia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, where he also was a research fellow, and from 2016 to 2021, he served as the managing editor at FPRI. And most important, he's a wonderful colleague, and you're in for a very exciting discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming today on this election day. You're going to get two reminders to vote, one right now and one at the end of the program. So if you have not yet voted, polls close at 8 o'clock tonight. Thank you, Susan and Lynn, for joining us today. The format of today's program is Susan and Lynn are going to give very brief framing remarks. Then we're going to jump into a discussion, and we're going to end with questions from you, the audience. I have my iPad for those of you who are on Zoom, and for audience members here at Perry World House, the microphone is over here by the glass wall. I will remind you again, the closer we get to audience questions, but start thinking of questions now. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Susan to start us off with some opening remarks.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and it's lovely to see this crowd of students, maybe others. Perry World House is always an interesting place to be because of the mix of people who are attracted to the wonderful programs they do here. I'm Susan Lindy. I've worked on the history of science and war in one form or another for about 30 years. And my intro is going to focus on the creation of the Atomic Energy Commission and on the way that Atoms for Peace, which was the premise that you could redeem the bomb by turning it into a benevolent technology. It could be used to make energy and also to, remember, the premise of atomic energy at the beginning is that it will bring development and prosperity to people all over the world. So after the United States had used the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, there was an immediate issue with how to manage this technology. And the fundamental initial question was, should the bomb be strictly a military technology, tightly controlled by defense interests, by the Army, with significant prison terms for scientists who revealed nuclear secrets, and with massive fines for that, as much as $100,000, which in 1945 was a lot of money. So, so there's a debate. At the beginning, the proposal is that it will be a military technology, but by the end of the fall, by December 1945, there were so many protests to that idea, and so many scientists who made the argument that nuclear technologies were going to be peaceful. They were going to be applied in science. They would be important to archaeology. And therefore, to make it strictly a military technology was to curb the value of this technology. So eventually, in the summer of 1946, a bill was passed, the McMahon bill, which created the Atomic Energy Commission. And the Atomic Energy Commission was supposed to be strictly a civilian institution. So this is one of those questions where science, knowledge, politics, and government policy all come together. There's a whole lot of intervening history, but the United States began almost instantly carrying out atmospheric weapons tests. And this is Crossroads at Bikini. This is the initial bombing of the Marshall Islands. It is the first big nuclear weapons test, and it was carried out as a media event. It was broadcast live on the radio. It was surrounded by cameras, by photographers, by news media. There were all kinds of troops there. And the premise of the Crossroads test was that it would reveal whether the Navy was going to be a useful service after the rise of nuclear weapons. And that's why Crossroads had those ships about to be scuttled out there right where the bomb was taking off. So where was I going? Oh, so all this weapons testing is happening, and there's information about fallout. And meanwhile, in December 1953, in an effort to make the bomb sound better, make it sound like something that could bring goodness into the world, Eisenhower, imagining it as psychological warfare and as propaganda, President Eisenhower announced that atomic energy would come to facilitate peace and prosperity. When he made the announcement, he had apparently done no discussion at all with the scientists at the Atomic Energy Commission. He had no idea what this would mean, what the risks would be, how radioactive materials could be circulated and shared all over the world. He hadn't even called it atoms for peace. He just said atoms that would facilitate peace. And the press dubbed it atoms for peace. Everybody loved it. And within about 3 weeks, his entire staff is trying to figure out how to make it happen because of international press coverage. So press coverage kind of pushed interest in Atoms for Peace, and Atoms for Peace became the key program for the distribution of radioactive materials through nuclear power plants all over the world. Transporting those materials, making them accessible to countries that did not already have nuclear capabilities, training an entire generation of nuclear engineers who were somehow going to have to know how to operate these plants and how to work with these potentially dangerous materials. This was a massive project. Atoms for Peace was only a little bit for peace, because the plan also was to have a pool of nuclear materials, that fissionable materials that would be available to nations that needed it. But the pool, the US planners wanted to set the contribution from the two superpowers at just the level at which it would be a strain for the Soviets to do it. So they said, we want the requirement for fissionable material to be X, such that X is easy for us to supply and hard for the Soviets. So you can see how even in Atoms for Peace, the game of who's ahead, who's behind is being played out. Am I over time? I can keep talking forever. So, the point is that also to be resolved as soon as Atoms for Peace was created, announced, publicized, embraced by the public, it would be a good thing for nuclear technologies to be widely available and to be usable for development, for energy production. There's also the question of safety. And, you know, the whole, what would I say here? I would say the texts devoted to safety in nuclear power and nuclear weapons could fill this entire room. They could probably fill all of Perry Worldhouse. If you take into account the corporate materials, the international groups that created safety standards, the scientific groups, the labor organizations, who should be exposed to radiation and how and under what circumstances. And I mentioned this because one of the things that got us to thinking about the question of nuclear technologies today has to do with Ukraine and the fact that a nuclear power plant or nuclear power plants in Ukraine came to be seen as potential bombs, because a good nuclear engineer knows how to cause a nuclear power plant to fail. And last March, as Russian troops had taken over Chernobyl, which, by the way, is still a dangerous place. It's still possible to do further damage at Chernobyl. They had one of our colleagues, Kate Brown and Susan Solomon, writing with her, they pointed out that in all these texts, all these predictions of doomsday, all these calculations of what the risks are, how to control them, who should have access, what the rules are, what the punishments are, nobody had considered the possibility that a nuclear power plant could be brought into an active military conflict in this way. So the imagination, our nuclear imagination, has been, at least in this respect, incomplete. And we started thinking about the continuing legacies of nuclear technologies, the imagination of how they can be safe, and their long reach, their continuing long reach.
Thanks. So I'm Lynn Meskel. I'm an archaeologist and anthropologist, and I came to Penn about 2 years ago with the pandemic. And because of fieldwork restrictions, I decided that the research I would do was at the Penn Museum and in the incredible archives managed by Alex Pizzardi, who's in the room. And it was, in fact, a real discovery. I thought I'd be working on the Middle East and the sorts of colonial histories, the things I'm usually drawn to. But I really made those discoveries that were 20th century discoveries about archaeologists working directly with people like Glenn Seaborg, who was chair of the Atomic Energy Commission. It was really the director, Froelich Rainey, who had these incredible international connections, but also believed that nuclear science was integral to the development of archaeology. And in fact, it has been. He was on the committee with Willard Libby, who decided what the materials were that were going to be tested for the first carbon-14 dating experiments. He worked with governments, also with the CIA, the State Department, but he also worked with scientists that were trying to develop a whole suite of new atomic applications. And that is actually still with us in archaeology in our discipline. These are the techniques that help us locate, to prospect for archaeological materials subsurface. He also worked on getting things like the first underwater submarine. And my colleague Sarah Laporte, who's an undergraduate here, and I have published material on that. So he was using or trying to use everything from U-2 spy planes to submarines, geoprospecting, also radar, just a number of sonic devices, all of these things were coming out of what we call the military, industrial, and now academic complex. So you might not think that archaeology is one of the disciplines that would be directly linked to atomic research, but we were one of the really the best beneficiaries. And Seaborg used us. He used medical developments like the MRI as one of the positive things that came out of weapons, out of the bomb, and archaeology was the second. So if you think about medicine, nuclear medicine and archaeology, so it might seem like an unusual connection, but we absolutely had those developments benefited our work, our field work abroad, and then you get into all of the international field work that also includes intelligence gathering, espionage, foreign diplomacy. So archaeologists are very good at that sort of work. I'd also encourage you to go to Penn Museum and look at a new exhibit by my colleague Emily Hammer here, looking at aerial archaeology and that sort of prospecting as well. So it may seem unusual, but we absolutely benefited and we continue to do so. And it also helps in the countries in which we choose to do our work as well. So there's always a political development. Yeah.
Both of you talked and hinted at the cooperation internationally, whether it's through Atoms for Peace and Eisenhower involving the Soviets, but to push the Soviets and the connections with the Penn Museum across the world. Can you talk about that collaborative effort internationally during the Cold War? We can start with Atoms for Peace and move to different specific sites that the Penn Museum worked on internationally. But how exactly did atomic science get involved with cultural diplomacy with both partners and our adversary, the Soviet Union, during the Cold War?
You know, one of the surprises of the Cold War, when you get really close to it, is that there was a lot of interaction between scientists in the West and scientists in the Soviet Union. And a lot of that interaction, I think Lynn talks about it a little bit, had qualities of espionage, but it's quiet espionage. You show up for the mathematics meeting and you're not openly talking about spying on anything, but you're trying to figure out what kind of math are the Russians doing, or you're trying to understand what, especially computing, which is immediately understood as a really important technological system. With computing, there's trade, these joint meetings, there's pure science, but really probably scientists on both sides are keeping an eye on the enemy to try to figure out where the Russians are, where the US is. And this was especially true for nuclear technologies. So when the physicists get together, it's not that they're sharing direct information, it's just that they are quietly spying on each other, collecting gossip, trying to figure out if anybody is ready to bolt or ready to reveal any information. Is there any way to get any information? And so I think that's a part of it. For Atoms for Peace, it's quite different, because the question of who could or should have nuclear power was not so friendly. It was highly coded. Only certain places around the world were seen as suitable locations for a nuclear power plant. What happened, and there's an interesting pattern. So for example, when the United States wanted to introduce nuclear power to India, the first phase of the training was to invite young Indian students to the United States to study nuclear engineering. And once you had a population of students that were trained in nuclear engineering, maybe you could bring the technology and have such a plant. So there's the training of the students, the fellowships for the students, the actual on the ground training in how to build and process and run such a plant, and then the construction of the plant. So it's kind of like you've got to get your people first and then your technology. But I guess my overall point is that we think of it as a bipolar world. There was a lot of interaction all across all the lines, across all different types of political organizations, and science and technology were a big part of that.
If I could just add to that, I give two examples. One is this museum director, Frolic Rainey, and his work in Russia. He started as an archaeologist in the 30s in Alaska, and he thought Alaska was the sort of linchpin, particularly in terms of the Cold War. And he thought that cultural exchanges, bringing students to the US, professors to work on archaeological questions, and for American scholars based at the museum to go to Russia, was a way of developing a sort of diplomacy that would actually be better, because he was advising Kissinger, if you can believe it, would be a better, I mean, an archaeologist advising Kissinger is interesting in itself, but he thought that that would be a better strategy than any nuclear deterrent. And he was advising him through the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which is still going, based in Philadelphia. And I believe, Tom, you're part of it. So this is sort of history, but also in the present. So his Russian sort of engagement was a key part of his career, but he launched projects all over the world. He was museum director for about 30 years. So he had some spying missions and archaeological collaborations in Iran, Afghanistan, Libya, where he was definitely doing espionage work. But one of the most interesting field cases, I think, was going to Italy. And I hadn't realized how important Italy was immediately following the Second World War. So he got in with some people that had, again, physics, geoprospecting training, Carlo Lerici, and remember that so many nuclear scientists had come from Italy. Think of Enrico Fermi. So those guys were ahead of the game. And I think the US was very nervous about European scientists. So Rainey was the perfect person to do this. And a lot of money was given to him to have collaborations in the field, finding tombs, Etruscan painted tombs, for example, buried classical cities in the site of Sybaris, to do all of this, to test out the moon drill, the sonic device, all of these incredible gadgets that were themselves the product of this military industrial academic complex, that were using Navy technology, Silicon Valley technology, and this is in the 50s and 60s. So there's this incredible crossover, and it's not just a one-way application of archaeologists borrowing military or lunar tech, but in fact, the military coming back. For example, he went on television to talk about some of his discoveries, and then the army reaches out and says, we'd like to use some of your subsurface gadgetry for our own purposes in Vietnam, for example. So in fact, it's a two-way street. So again, archaeologists are not usually thought of in those very inventive terms, but in terms of instrumentation, I think Penn was really was cutting edge. Yeah.
I know everyone's going to ask this in the audience. So I'm going to ask Lynn now. It sounds like Rainey was Indiana Jones.
He was certainly very charming. Let us say that. I obviously did not know him personally. He was very charming, very good on television. He had many, many international projects. He had worked for the State Department. As I said, he had been in the Second World War. He had been in Berlin. There's a lot of story to tell there. Yeah.
And Susan, you talked a bit about how the United States used India as a model where they brought students over, and that's actually happening right now with Australia, where we're teaching them how to develop nuclear submarines, and we're training nuclear engineers as a way to combat China. So it's interesting that we don't think that a lot of these applications or things that happened 50 years ago can actually be applied now. So it's very fascinating that what we did with India is now being used with Lynn's home country.
Can I just comment on Rainey? So the first time, so when Lynn, I had heard of Frolic Rainey because he's the name of the auditorium at the museum. I've been to the Rainey Auditorium. But when Lynn first sent me the account of his life, I said, you are making this guy up. There's no way there was he's pretty incredible. And he has an autobiography, which is, I don't know, kind of racy reading. So, the point I think what you're trying to, or the question is partly about how how are technologies, how do you introduce a novel technology to a different country? So how do you introduce, say, nuclear submarines? You can't just send the submarine, okay? That's not going to work. You got to get the expertise. You even have to get the ideology of safety. You've got to get the supply systems. You've got to have people have to be fully on board. Now, there's a wonderful paper on the use of swimming pool reactors. Swimming pool reactors weren't really that important for undergraduate education, but they were so pretty. And if you had one, your students were more likely, your undergrads were more likely to get interested in nuclear engineering. So many Midwestern universities training those Midwestern young men who had to be recruited to nuclear engineering for the purposes of the Cold War, they had swimming pool reactors. Elite universities didn't, because they were training the theoretical physicists who were going to change the world. But the University of Kansas needed a swimming pool reactor because you could bring the students in and enroll them, enlist them. And I would say the other thing I talk about in some of my work is, I call it love or seduction. In many cases, you have to persuade people in general, and maybe students, you have to seduce them with the technology. You've got to pull them into how cool the technology is so that they want to devote their lives to it. And we see in these Cold War systems efforts to enlist, seduce, enroll people all over the world, bring them in, persuade them they need this technology, teach them how to use it, and then sell it to them. Because remember, this has commercial elements as well.
So we've talked about some of the positive elements. We should also now flip over to some of the more darker and negative side. So we know that Rainey, the former director of the Penn Museum, had all these government connections. Did any of his site visits or anything, were they ever negatively affected either by his affiliation with these, like the CIA, or just geopolitics at large? Like, he goes into a country like Italy and says, well, we're going to start a dig here, but because of Cold War relations, did something not happen? Or he walks in the room and everyone says, oh, we know who he's going to be telling our secrets to.
I honestly think he was very, very well connected, whether it was with the military, like, I have a friend in the Air Force who can fly the U-2 spy plane over southern Italy, or I know the American ambassador. I think all of his work was very heavily facilitated. And I think we have to also remember that sitting in Philadelphia in those years, it's very connected to, as it still is, to Washington. So those connections facilitated these incredible, sort of like 18 projects at a time all over the world, things that we could really probably no longer ever afford, sustain, or justify. So I think it facilitated his work. The fact that he has people like Glenn Seaborg on his science planning committee, that he's getting money from the NSF, from Carnegie, from Ford, from Rockefeller. He's also getting huge philanthropists to support the museum and their expeditions. I think it went very well for him. He did run into trouble in Afghanistan. He was in Libya when he perhaps shouldn't have been. But certainly with the Italian project, that was great timing. Italy was, I wouldn't say a client state, but Italy was parallel to the US in terms of Cold War policy. The US was very concerned about communism there. I'm just actually starting a new project looking at Tikal in Guatemala, where Rainey has to wait to go into to excavate this enormous site, this pyramidal site of Tikal, because of the coup, the 1954 coup in Guatemala, which is funded by the CIA, backed by the CIA, the government, and United Fruit, which was the Dulles brothers. So that's one case where all of his connections couldn't help him literally into this sort of insertion into the jungle, into the jungles of the Petén particularly. And he's very happy to work with the military dictators that came after the deposing of Arbenz and his democratically elected government. So there were a few hiccups, but this was over 30 years, a remarkably resilient person who used all of those connections and this idea of doing good science to yeah, for sort of the glory of the institution and himself. Yeah.
So we've been talking, and a lot of names have been said, and all of the names have been men. During the Cold War, what role did women play in the development of these fields? Because they are relatively new fields after World War II. Did that make it easier for women in academia or in government to get involved? And are there any notable people that really pushed this forward?
Many scientific fields were not particularly open to women in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. It wasn't a banner time period. There was a kind of a policy of getting rid of the women, get them back into the home because they've been working in professional positions during the war because of the displacement of the men. And so what do you do with them afterward? So I don't, your question, what you're really asking is, was there progress for women after the war? And unfortunately, and I'm really drawing on the work of Margaret Rossiter, who's done a fabulous job of tracking the experiences of women scientists. Unfortunately, the change is pretty slow, and it's really in the 1970s that certain barriers to women, even in PhD programs at many universities, begin to lift. So it wasn't, it's all new technology, but it wasn't a fabulous opportunity for women. And women were viewed, almost all nuclear technology and almost all scientific work in the nuclear domain was secret. It was top secret. It was, you had to have security clearance to work in those fields. And one thing I saw at one point, I was reading letters of recommendation and concerns about women as more vulnerable to Russian spies, more likely to be tricked, and therefore not as likely to be safe in a secure laboratory. So questions of security shaped who could be employed in the national labs. People who were understood to be gay were also unlikely to be employed in the national labs because they could be they could be outed, and they were therefore vulnerable, and therefore they could be manipulated by the Russians. And so if there was a hint that somebody was gay, they wouldn't be hired. Women were less likely to be hired in the national labs and for secret projects. So the intense secrecy, I guess the point I want to make is that the intense secrecy of post-war nuclear sciences worked against opening them to women, because women weren't necessarily trustworthy. They were easily persuaded. They were emotional. I think, isn't that right? Women are emotional. They were emotional, and therefore they could be easily tricked.
So my story is a little different because I'm talking about Penn Museum, Frolic Rainey, the development of all these incredible labs that we had through the museum. And the person that really ran those and knew the science was a woman called Elizabeth Ralph. So she actually did the field work. She was the only person who could fix all the kit when it broke down in the field, which it invariably did, or you had to fly some guy from Silicon Valley all the way out. Elizabeth Ralph was the person who was in the field in Mexico, in Guatemala, in Italy. And that's a sort of partially known story. She was given an award I think late in her career from the Society for American Archaeology. So she's known by the people who really practice archaeological science in our field. But she was a Penn person with degrees in chemistry and physics. And she was the one who enabled all of this incredible prospection, the dating techniques, ran the carbon-14 lab. She was interested in things like thermoluminescence, dendrochronology, fission track dating, all these incredible technologies which were just being developed at that time. So it wasn't really down to your Indiana Jones charismatic guy in the field. It was actually this woman running, staffing, fixing all the instrumentation that made that international program of research, covering the globe possible.
And a lot of our discussion has been focused on things that have been happening, either starting in Philadelphia or actually in Philadelphia. And we don't really think of Philly as a place where geopolitical intrigue can really happen that is left for the better, allegedly, cities of New York and Washington. So could you talk about the critical role that Philly had played historically and even today in the development of atomic science? Because in Philly, we have so many great schools, or the location between New York and DC and how that helped link up the two cities with people like Henry Kissinger, who you don't often connect to Philadelphia.
Okay, so the Foreign Policy Research Institute, that sort of think tank, brought these notable people from Philadelphia. Tom, you must be one of those now.
I'm from Philly, so
to work out the world's problems. And so it's fascinating to me that an archaeologist would be asked to join that and to advise Kissinger. And in fact, Kissinger sent him on a trip around the world to look at what he considered developing countries to stave off issues like communism, the threat of war, how to do this in an effective way. And he went with a colonel as well to accompany him to do that and then come back and advise. And that's when Rainey decided that technical assistance programs, nuclear deterrence were not the way, that actually cultural diplomacy with programs like exchanges of scholars and archaeological fieldwork collaborations and partnerships between countries was the way to create peace, that it wasn't about stockpiling weapons. But yeah, Philly also had these incredible donors. So what I find in my work is all these field projects around the world, which cost, Tikal was supposed to cost $1 million. If you think about that in the late 50s and early 60s, $1 million to resurrect these pyramids in the jungle, plus excavation. That was all funded by people who were wealthy notables. So, Pew Foundation, you had Fidelity, you had Sun Oil, you had, again, more oil companies in New Jersey. It's really striking to me. I've just come from Stanford and I think of Silicon Valley, but this was absolutely incredible. So this was where the money was. And a lot of the techniques were being pioneered too. Whereas again, like Silicon Valley had some tech, but they had nowhere to test anything. So it was this array or network of partnerships. But yeah, Philadelphia allowed all of that to happen. So it happened at Penn, kind of not anywhere else to the same scale.
So we're good at things beyond losing 2 championships in one day, it sounds like. I'm going to ask a couple more questions and then we're going to go to questions from you, the audience. I already have a few lined up on Zoom. So if you want to start lining up now, we'll be able to churn through questions as quickly as we can. We want to make sure that everybody gets their questions answered. So Susan, I want to ask you about the war in Ukraine. You talked about Chernobyl a little bit. And there's another power plant further, I guess it's in southeastern Ukraine, that was in the news over the summer because it was constantly being attacked. It was shelled. There might be a meltdown. So where does the Ukraine example fit into this narrative? Because we saw there's Atoms for Peace. The Soviets cooperated as best that they could with that. But with the war in Ukraine, it's almost like Russia is now re-weaponizing power plants that they had built during the Cold War.
And I think that's a great verb for it, is to re-weaponize or to take something. It was always understood that a nuclear power plant something could go wrong in a very bad way that could injure a lot of people, that could produce a huge amount of radiation, that could lead to the evacuation of large areas. We've seen it happen at Fukushima. It happened at Chernobyl. Chernobyl produced enough radiation to spread all over the world. This was the worst nuclear disaster ever. But I think that what hadn't been anticipated was that you could strategically choose to attack a nuclear power plant and to exploit that incipient technological capability to release that radiation and terrify people. And for me, what it did is to transform every nuclear power plant in the entire world into a weapon in an unexpected way. So it's sort of, it's striking, and it's a reminder that these networks they're standing, they're present. The risk is not any less in some ways than it ever was. It's really striking.
We'll start with questions from the audience.
Thank you for your time. Curtis Garner, War MBA program. Ms. Lindy, can you talk a little bit about,
Adjust the mic.
can you talk a little bit about what you see the future of nuclear proliferation to look like, as well as your thoughts from like more of an international relations perspective on like the nuclear peace theory, if the proliferation of nuclear weapons contributes at all to global stability or if it's a detractor?
You know, I'm in touch with a lot of people in the activist community who are working on non-proliferation. That's a huge goal for many people all over the world. I wonder if these technological systems can be left behind and what would be the mechanism that would make it possible. In my field, we talk about something called technological systems theory, and that's the idea that you have technologies have like a socio-technical system built around them. They're not just the machine itself, they're the people, the laws, the policies, the systems for tracking materials and shipping materials. So if you look at it that way, how do you get to a time when there is no more nuclear risk? Now, you're asking me for a future prediction for what it will mean for international relations, and I can't predict it. I don't know. I don't feel very positive about the possibility of no more nukes at any time, partly because of what I just said. If you think about all those nuclear power plants and the capabilities that they have, they can function as you know, in practice, nuclear weapons, and they're all over the world, and they can be leveraged to do a great deal of damage. And for many, you know, decades now, we've had enough nuclear weapons to annihilate everyone. So it's a system that kind of runs on its own. It keeps going. And where do you intervene to stop it? And I wish I had a better answer for you. I'm sorry.
I'll go to a question from Zoom now. China is overseeing a growth in developing nuclear power facilities. Is there a new paradigm that the U.S. is missing?
What is I don't fully understand the question.
I think the point of the question is that there's a lot of growth in both nuclear weapons in China and nuclear power plants.
Yeah.
And in the US, we aren't really seeing those developments on the scale that we are seeing in China. And is it something that the United States needs to look at and reevaluate our own positions and policies to compete better with China?
The United States has not been building nuclear power plants, and it's not because of moral concerns, and it's not because of fears about accidents, it's because of insurance. So the market, the cost of the liability questions raised by nuclear power plants are so high that they are not being constructed in the United States, regardless of their capacity to solve some problems of energy. I personally don't think nuclear power plants are at all a good paradigm. I don't think they solve anything. And so my answer for the Chinese model is not exactly, but I will see what Lynn thinks. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much for your time. We've been talking a lot about kind of the systems of this academic, military, industrial complex in nuclear energy in the past. How do we incentivize these in other areas to help stimulate innovation as well as kind of helping countries develop better not better foreign policy, but more secure for foreign policy?
Yeah.
That's the question. Like, how do we incentivize these systems? Sorry.
So you're asking how we incentivize countries that want to develop more nuclear technologies.
I meant more broadly, like we've seen it specifically in nuclear within the United States, but how can we apply this to different technologies, not just nuclear? Like, how do we build these systems effectively?
Yeah, well, if you take the nuclear engineer model, the way you incentivize it is you create a massive fellowship program and you bring young people to study at great universities in the United States, like the University of Pennsylvania, and you train them in the technical methods, but as I mentioned, also in the ideology, the politics. I would say it's odd, like you look at this Cold War stuff, and when you're training those young engineers, it's clear you're enlisting them on the side of democracy. So you're enlisting them on the side of capitalism, like the United States, when it's inviting people to train here, it's not just the technical expertise. It's, how do we pull them into our view of the world? And then they go back with the US view of the world. So it's kind of That was the old model. That's how you enlisted people and persuaded them to be interested in these technologies, but it's more than that. How do you persuade them to care about democracy, capitalism, quote, freedom? You bring them to the United States.
Can I just add, it's just on that point, it's very interesting because the military industrial, I think it was congressional triangle that Eisenhower was talking about, the Iron Triangle, the person who made it military industrial and academic was Fulbright. And so the person who also had that idea of sending American scholars out post World War II to understand the rest of the world, because this fine country, after, you know, helping win the Second World War, realized it didn't really know as much as it should perhaps about other countries, languages, cultures, that was going to be very important for the future. So Fulbright was instrumental there, and also bringing people to the US to understand those ways. So you can call it diplomacy, intelligence, fact-finding, mutual understanding with education, but that's also part of the ideology and skills transfer.
I know when I did my Fulbright in Taiwan, they constantly said a little more knowledge and a little less conflict. They kept hammering that home to us. And I hope it may have worked with me. So we have a question from Zoom for Lynn. How are we seeing archaeology and technology coming together in similar ways today as it did in the Cold War?
So there has been a proliferation of archaeological science, right? So what I find fascinating is my colleagues that do things like isotopic analysis don't always know where that research stemmed from and how we got to this point, how nuclear isotopes were sent around the world and so on. So we actually have a very well developed archaeological science wing. The US perhaps started a lot of this work post World War II. It's largely been taken over, I think, though, by the UK and Europe, interestingly. So the National Science Foundation doesn't give as much money as some of the British and European foundations for that. But this is a huge area. Also, we use a lot of satellite imagery. So it's not just these atomic or products of atomic research, but we also use that intelligence gathering, whether it's, submarine, so underwater, on land, from the air. We use, as I said, spy satellites, spy planes, and so on. There's an ethical dimension to all of that. So we are still living, we've just ramped up that Cold War set of connections. And because archaeologists go all over the world, we have to do this kind of field work. It's very different from our sister disciplines of history and anthropology. There is also that fantastic cover for gathering other sorts of information as well. So we're a very different kind of field science, and we have to know the language. Think of Lawrence of Arabia. He was also an archaeologist. We have to know the language, the culture, the people, and the terrain.
Thank you for this panel. My question is that we touch upon some security risks, such as the cybersecurity or the nuclear weapon proliferation. But there is also a third threat, which is created by the environmental problem as well as the public health problem stemming from the waste disposal of nuclear. But there seems to be a lot of NIMBYism as well as internal politics and a lack of long-term planning and financial resources dedication to this part. So I wonder whether you ask is for what is the path forward to solve this potential risk?
That's there's no simple answer to that question. And as I'm sure you know, there's been a huge enterprise to figure out what to do with all the radioactive materials produced by nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. And at this stage, there's no good storage place for them. In Fukushima today, you drive past fields full of giant bags of contaminated soil, and the trees are growing out of the the life is growing out of the bags and the materials are coming back into the ecosystem. The level of damage produced by radioactive materials at Hanford, at Savannah River, at accident sites all over the world, at Palomares, at everywhere, at Thule, everywhere where planes crashed, where things exploded, where plants were or production facilities were. It is astonishing. And the astonishing thing about it too is that the long-term, it'll, in terms of our lives, it will continue to be dangerous in practice for all of human history in perpetuity. So there's nowhere to put it. There's nowhere to store it. You could, one solution would be to say that there needs to be an international agreement for standards for what to do with such materials, how to process them, where to place them. In general, of course, the most contaminated spaces are those spaces that belong or are occupied by persons who have less political power. So they end up without, for example, the Marshall Islanders, their lands were taken away from them at Maralinga in Australia, in Nevada, around Hanford. And the planners for these sites took the position that they were not valuable, the people were not valuable, and they could be basically permanently ruined. So it's a really tragic case of environmental damage, and it is global. It's all over the world. There are places that are heavily irradiated where radioactive waste is still a problem. It's still a problem in places near Fukushima. There are places where you don't want to go. And families, having to leave their homes. So that's the reason that if you ask me, should we ever build another nuclear weapon or another nuclear power plant, I would say no, we got to stop, because the waste from this, the environmental and ecological consequences are permanent, and there's no obvious solution for them.
Can I just jump in? It's a great question. And I direct you to a book written by a colleague of mine called Rosemary Joyce, who's written a book called The Future of Nuclear Waste. And she's an archaeologist. And again, what's really strange about the implications of our field is that for the Yucca Mountain complex, archaeologists were invited to come in, I think with artists as well, to try and help advise the government and different authorities on how you could signal warning for millennia to come. As archaeologists who are used to decoding Egyptian hieroglyphs, Maya glyphs, and so on, is a very odd concatenation of experts, but they were asked to help develop a language that would be intelligible for millennia, of not to go into these areas, not to dig in such regions, and that there were toxic chemicals and so on. So again, I would direct you to that book to just see the sort of strange bedfellows that are brought together through this sort of atomic legacy.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. My name is Natsu, and I'm studying computer science at the School of Engineering. And you mentioned in the talk about how the Cold War facilitated some discussions between scientists of both sides. And as we are entering some sort of a second Cold War between the US and China, how do you see the development of academic cross-country communication will develop in the future? And what are some differences that you expect between scientific collaboration in the first kind of Cold War and collaboration in this kind of Cold War? I know that you present like a more optimistic picture about this, but I'm curious to know what your reasoning behind that is, and maybe comments on specific to your field of expertise as well.
I don't have that much expertise on contemporary relations, contemporary collaborations between China and the United States built around scientific problems. All I know is that there are such collaborations, and do they function in the same way that the Cold War ones did, in the sense that often the intent was to both help, but also to collect information. There's a lot of curiosity about what's happening in China and around science and technology. And so I have to assume that the expertise scientists are being called in to study that. What that looks like now and what that's going to look like in the future, I just don't know.
Final question.
Thanks for being here today and having a really engaging talk. I was wondering if you're able to speak to, we're super close to Middletown. I was there the other day and drove by 3 Mile Island. If you could speak to at all how that incident impacted Philadelphia's involvement in nuclear science in the Cold War. I know it was a chunk of time in between those 2 time periods, but very close to home, of course.
3 Mile Island is so important, but not because of the radiation. Or the way to think about it is there wasn't much radiation released at 3 Mile Island. This is the nuclear power plant on the islands just south of Harrisburg on the Susquehanna River. But the incident itself was it was a lightning rod for activism. And a lot of the activism, interestingly, was built around, it was conservative activism. It was mothers, pregnant women worried about the radiation exposure of their developing, fetus. And so it became, so part of the reason that 3 Mile Island became such a lightning rod is that it attracted this central Pennsylvania conservative element to get involved in preventing future nuclear accidents and future nuclear power plants. So it's counterintuitive in a funny way. It takes us somewhere you wouldn't expect. And of course, expertise came from Philadelphia to try to help solve the problem of what had happened at the plant. But it's a relatively minor compared to many of the other accidents I just mentioned. In terms of radiation exposure, it's minor. It was very short. It was a minimal amount of radiation, but it has an outsized impact on the politics of radiation and nuclear risk because of the activism built around it.
Please join me in thanking Lynn and Susan for a great discussion.